time is that?
Concert, I think it's 7.
Where is it?
Knoxville.
Of course. 3, 4. It'll be over with by 4. It will be over by 4, before 4. Okay, while folks are coming in and getting settled down, I want to mention, I said that I had recommended a book, and this is the book, and I'm not really following this, but I just like it, and it's a good book. And if you were in the United Methodist Women in 1996, or for maybe the next 4 or 5 years after that, this was one of the things that was being recommended by the women's groups to study. And I've done this study in some church studies a couple of times, and I don't know that it's in print anymore, but you know how all that works with Amazon. You want to find stuff out of print, you can find it. And so you might be able to find this book. It's not long. It's just a little bit more than 100 pages, and it's got a study guide in it. But it's just a really good book. John Wesley, Holiness of Heart and Life by Charles Yoguren. And he, in 1996. Don't be intimidated by all of the notes. I'm not going to talk about every bit of this. I just was throwing out some names for you. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But what I wanted to do to begin with was I wanted to read to you a little bit from the book of Discipline. And this is paragraph 104 of the book of Discipline. And it's in a section that's entitled Our Theological Task. And in that section, the discipline speaks to Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience, the quote-unquote Wesleyan quadrilateral. And this is not all, but this is a little bit of what the book of Discipline says about the subject of tradition. The theological task does not start anew in each age or each person. Christianity does not leap from New Testament times to the present as though nothing were to be learned from the great cloud of witnesses in between. For centuries, Christians have sought to interpret the truth of the gospel for their time. This is referred to here as a dynamic element. In other words, this is the continuing activity of God's Spirit, transforming human life. We want to recognize that we are challenged by traditions from around the world that have embraced Christianity. And each of these worldwide traditions brings just a little bit of themselves to the work of the church, to the gospel of Christ, and in particular to the work of United Methodists. And to that end, a few years ago, someone wrote a book called The Sunday Services of United Methodists. And this interesting little book tells about the service of the Methodist Church in England, South India, Australia, Canada, Korea, Singapore, Kenya, Zimbabwe, the Caribbean, Latin America, Germany, and the United States. And it's as thick as it is because all of those places have put their own little twist on Methodism and on how they practice it as part of the church. So how did we get to be where we are? Well, the first, if you remember back to the first time, those of you who were here, I kind of did a very loose run through of history. Well, now we need to be a little bit more specific. And so I want to do so by looking at some dates which may be some things that you might recognize. So the first date is the year 1766. In 1766, two Methodist cousins, a man named Philip Embry and a woman named Barbara Heck, formed a Methodist class in New York City. Now, what do you know about 1766? What, are we the United States at that point? No. We're what? We're a bunch of colonies. Well, all right, so this first society that is still in existence today. It's known as the John Street United Methodist Church. Not the original building, but the congregation. 1766. Not too far distant from that, that was New York City. There was a Methodist Society in Maryland. Not Baltimore, but in Frederick County, Maryland. And then another one in Philadelphia. Which was a major city. And so those were grouped around the year 1766. So what we see happening is in New York City, remember this is in New York City, Maryland, and Philadelphia. That is where the first groups of Methodists start to meet together. And these are people who have immigrated to the New World, and they want to continue what they had been part of in England. So, my next year is 1771. Okay. In 1771, are we the United States yet? No, we are not the United States yet. In 1771, Francis Asbury, you know this name? All right. Francis Asbury comes to the New World. He was sent with someone else by John Wesley to help organize or serve these Methodist societies. And he does, and he never goes back to England. Then in 1775, why did I write that date down? Oh, there it is. In 1775, John Wesley, knowing what's going on, is concerned. What's going on in 1775? Yeah, it started. The revolution did not start in 1776 all of a sudden. There was lots of things that led up to it. You know your American history. So in 1775, John Wesley is really concerned because John Wesley is a loyal Englishman, and he is a loyal subject of King George III, and he writes a calm address to our American colonies where he is critical of this desire for independence that he sees going on in the New World. Reckon anybody pays him any attention? Well, they might in England, but they don't in the United States. Okay, so what happens is all of these societies are still going on, and they're still doing what Wesley told them to do. That is, they're having their meetings, but then they are going to the local, what kind of a church? Yes, Anglican Church of England for worship. And that's what Wesley expected them to do. But what happens in 1776? All right, the formal revolution, and then when does it end? 1783. We do have a historian among us. So 1783. So then Wesley has got to do something for these Methodists. And the reason why this is a serious problem is that the Anglican clergy, who were pastors of the Episcopal Anglican Church of England churches, among other things, took an oath of loyalty to the crown. And they weren't going to stay with these upstarts. So they didn't. And all of a sudden, not only the Methodists, but the rest of the Episcopalians, they were cut off from the sacraments. And this was a serious matter for John Wesley. He believed that the sacraments are absolutely essential for Christians. And so in 1784, he does something extraordinary. And if John Wesley did not know the tradition of the church, he couldn't have done this. Because what John Wesley was doing was he was using the tradition of the church to study two words from Greek. He was looking at the word presbyter and he was looking at the word episkopos. So presbyter is going to make you think of what? And episkopos is going to make you think of what? Yes, correct. All right, the word presbyter means elder or old man, depending on how you want to translate it, in Greek. But in biblical times, it came to be a way to refer to church leaders, meaning more elder in terms of elder with the faith, having been brought up or having been taught or having learned the faith of the church. Episkopos is a Greek word that means overseer or superintendent. And when episkopos gets translated into English, it comes out bishop. And when presbyter gets translated into English, it often comes out priest. So, what Wesley's study of Greek, and remember, Wesley has taught Greek at Oxford. That was one of his jobs along the way, teaching Greek at Oxford University. So what he comes to the conclusion, he's not the only one to do this, he was basing this on what he had read in church history. He wants to recognize that in the Bible, these two words are virtually equal. They accomplish the same thing. And based on that conclusion, Wesley decides that in a significant emergency, a presbyter could function as an episcopos. And he believes this is a significant moment. And so John Wesley, who has been ordained as a presbyter, as an elder, as a priest of the Church of England, takes it upon himself to function as he refers to himself as a spiritual episcopos. And he's very careful to use that word, spiritual episcopos. He uses the Greek word. And what he does is he takes Thomas Coke. Anybody heard of Thomas Coke? What do you have to do with Coca-Cola? Not a thing in the world. Yes, correct. All right, Thomas Coke is English. He is also a graduate of Oxford University. He is often referred to as Dr. Coke because he has a degree that is called a Doctor of Civil Laws, which meant he was educated in the area of local town administration. And he could function like as a mayor of a town. I don't think he ever did, but that was his degree. And Wesley will constantly refer to him as Dr. Coke. But he is also ordained as a priest of the Church of England. So what Wesley does is Wesley lays hands on Thomas Coke as a spiritual episcopos and sets him aside to go to North America to locate Francis Asbury and to do to Francis Asbury what Wesley did to him, and Francis Asbury would then become the chief spiritual episcopos for the church in America, which would take the formal organization, not of a society, but of a church. And all of this happens on December 24, 1784. John Wesley does this stuff, this ordaining stuff in September. By December 24, Coke has sailed to America. He's found Francis Asbury. He's told Francis Asbury they've gathered what they could of the class officials. They've made a formal organization as a church. And Asbury has been set aside as a spiritual episcopos. Or it was perfectly fine if he wanted to use the term general superintendent, which he doesn't choose to use. Nor does he choose to use spiritual episcopos. Instead, it is Francis Asbury who says, nope, I'm a bishop. And he is the one who sets the pattern for the United Methodist Church to have bishops. Francis Asbury. Wesley didn't like this. He said he'd rather be dead than called a bishop. But he couldn't do anything about it. There's a big old ocean in between, and besides all that, now the church had formed, and Wesley, who is a spiritual father to Methodism, has no control of it anymore. He's let go of it. And he knew that that was what he was doing when he did all of this. Okay, so there is an example from the tradition of the church as to how we got to be organized as a church in the United States. If Wesley hadn't been schooled and appreciated the tradition of the church, he would not have been able to come to this particular conclusion the way that he did. He might have still come to it, but it just would have been a little bit of a different way. Now, when Wesley sends Thomas Coke over, he also decides these Americans, they have been cut loose. Somehow God has done this. I don't agree with it, but I have to live with it. He said this was a real strange thing, but if this is the way it is, they've got to have some help. So what Wesley did was, in addition to Thomas Coke, he sent over a copy of the Book of Common Prayer that he had abridged. Now, what does it mean to abridge something? Yeah, and boy, did he shorten it. Yeah, he did. He did away with a lot of things that are in the Book of Common Prayer. But one of the things that he didn't do away with was the Sunday service. Sunday service. So, you have, among those papers that you picked up, a copy of John Wesley's Order for Morning Prayer. Now, I have to be honest and tell you, I have no idea how I came across this specifically. I think this was put into my hands by a retired pastor who was cleaning out all of his stuff, and this was, I believe, something that the church did maybe around 1984 when we were celebrating the bicentennial at a conference or a district thing somewhere. And so this is taken from John Wesley's abridgment of the morning prayer service of the Church of England. And this is what Wesley intended for Methodists to use every Sunday. And I'm not going to go through this piece by piece because you've got it and it's there for you to read. But what I will tell you is the hymn that's listed here, Love Divine, All Love's Excelling, good Charles Wesley hymn. And then on the back page, the hymn, God of Grace and God of Glory. Those were put in this service by the people who put the service together so that it was actually used in that service. In Wesley's abridgment, he said you can put in hymns where you feel like it's good for them to go. He wasn't real specific about that. But what he did was he included the service from the Book of Common Prayer largely intact. And you can read it for yourself. I put on the back page of those notes. You've got a page that says Tradition Notes. So what I've done on the back page is I've given you additional notes to this order of worship so you can see some of those things come from and what are the proper titles for some of these things. Like the Collect for Purity. I talked about that a while back, a couple weeks ago. Well, and that's here. And then you can read the other parts of it. You can see that there are parts of it that come from the Bible, then parts of it that call for readings from the Bible that are to vary depending on what the day is. There's the order. Generally speaking, you have confession, followed by scripture, sermon, and prayers. And then he specifies the prayers to use. Collect for the day, collect for peace, collect for grace, blessing from 2 Corinthians, and a benediction. So this is what he thought Methodists would use. You ever used anything like this in church? No. I mean, I actually used this one time in the church when we were doing the Wesley study, or at least parts of it. I didn't use the whole thing. It's lengthy. In the 1780s, people had more time than we do today. So I thought that was, now this is a wonderful piece of the church tradition. And John Wesley thought, when he thought of church tradition, he thought of the Church of England and the Book of Common Prayer. He loved those words. He loved the way they sounded. He believed that they were deeply scriptural and that they were words that were powerful in educating us to be the people of God. This is a part of our church tradition that is handed on to us. And there are even parts of that we still have and use today. For example, on that page, I wrote that, I showed you that couple of these things. The forgive my Latin, I don't know how to pronounce it necessarily, the Te Deum, the Canticle of the Holy Trinity. It's in the hymnal, number 880, page 80. The Benedictus, which is Zechariah's song after he gets his speech back from when John is born, that's in the hymnal. And we use that around Christmas time. The call to prayer, we do the Dominus Vobiscum every time we have communion. Did you know that? The Lord be with you. That's it. That's what it is. The Lord be with you and also with you. And it's followed by the Kyrie eleison. Now you know what that means. What does it mean? Kyrie eleison means, Lord have mercy. Very good. So all of those are things that we still have in our hymnal and sometimes we use even today. Okay. Now, I want to look at a couple of other things that reflect around tradition, particularly as John Wesley used it for us. For example, the church year. When I was little and growing up in church, every Sunday I'd look at the bulletin and see what Sunday it was. This didn't dawn on me at first, and then I gradually began to get the idea. It wasn't the date, it wasn't the month and the day, it was the Sunday of the church year. This is a such and such Sunday after Pentecost. This is a such and such Sunday of Epiphany, or of Lent, or of Easter. Every Sunday in my home church growing up, it told me what Sunday it was. That's nothing that Wesley invented, nothing that the Methodist Church invented. It's something that we inherited from the tradition of the church. And I can tell you the history of that, but you don't want to hear that. It'd take way too long. But those church seasons were developed as a way of helping us to understand Jesus Christ. And so we have Christmas and we have Easter, but we also have these other seasons that reflect around who Jesus is and what Jesus was doing. We're given that as part of our tradition. The Book of Common Prayer, or liturgy. The word liturgy you could define liturgy as a bunch of stuff that we do in church that sometimes we sit down for and sometimes we stand up for, and we don't really know why we do what when we do it. But that's what all that stuff is. Well, liturgy it means the work of the people. That's what that word means. And so the worship of the church is meant to be our work, our service to God. We benefit from it, but we also believe that we're doing this as a response to God and that God expects us to participate in these things. And liturgy includes everything that we do on a Sunday morning service. It's all part of one thing, part of our worship of God. The creeds, particularly the Apostles' and the Nicene Creed, also part of our church tradition, and talked a little bit about that in church history. Continuity, the line of apostolic succession, orders of deacon, elder, presbyter, bishop, and sacraments. I'll get to that in a minute if we have time. I'm watching my time. Now, the next section is the part that you were afraid I was going to get into a lot of detail of, and you were going to be tested on it, and you weren't looking forward to it. It's a bunch of names. Well, the only reason I put these on there is so that you will know when John Wesley preached, he would very frequently refer to people like these. And all of these people on this list are people that John Wesley quoted from in his sermons. Because, one, he thought that what they said was really important. And most of these people, as a matter of fact, every one on this list, comes from the first 400 years of the church. The other thing was, he thought his Methodist people should know it too. Now, a lot of the things that these people wrote, you have heard anyway. You just don't know that you have heard it. So what I did was I give you some names and just a tiny little bit of biographical information about them. Let me share a couple of little things about just a couple of them. Oh, let's see. Okay. Jerome. See the name Jerome down there toward the bottom of the list? 340 to 420, scholar and translator of the Vulgate Bible. Jerome lived in the Holy Land, we'd call it. He ended up living in Jerusalem toward the end of his life, and that's where he died. He was given the task of, by no less than Emperor Constantine, he was given the task of pulling together the Bible, all of the different Bibles that he could find, and making sure that they accurately reflected the original languages. So he is doing this in Latin. And the word Vulgate means the common tongue. And he had to consult Greek and Hebrew, so he had to know Latin was his native language, but he also had to know Greek and Hebrew in order to do this. Well, he's given this task, and so he at one point writes a letter. You urge me to revise the old Latin version and, as it were, to sit in judgment on the copies of the Scriptures which are now scattered throughout the whole world. And inasmuch as they differ from one another, you would have me decide which of them agree with the Greek original. The labor is one of love, but at the same time both perilous and presumptuous. For in judging others, I must be content to be judged by all. So he knew that what he was doing was a huge task. This was before there was any copyrights and any standard version of the Bible that everyone said this is authoritative. They just didn't exist. There was a copy here, there was a copy there. These were done by monks writing in a monastery somewhere, and sometimes there were differences in spelling, because not all the monks could spell very good, especially if it wasn't the language that they knew. And there was sometimes a difference in the way a phrase was translated, if it had been translated from Greek to Latin. So what he does is he pulls all of this together and he comes up with the Latin Vulgate, which is a direct descendant or a direct ancestor of every Bible that you have, that you use in whatever translation it is. Every single one of those depends on the work of Jerome, done back in the 340s. Origen. Origen is an early biblical scholar. And he recognizes that we have to think intelligently about the Bible. For example, he writes a letter to some priests that he knows, and he's writing on them for their preaching. And he says, now look, you need to know, God does not expect you to bring out yesterday's fare, F-A-R-E, meal, when they set about to address the people, not to set forth doctrines according to the letter, but by God's grace, to bring forth new truth, ever to discover the spiritual lessons. Remember the Bible, the offering of first fruits. They must be fresh and new. Everywhere you see what belongs to the praise of God. For this is what the sacrifice of praise means. So as far back as Origen, and I gave you his dates, 185 to 254, he was telling the priests, you got to know your Bible and you got to work hard so that the people you are preaching to understand what they are hearing. That's part of your job. And that's still true in the church today. I gave you Tertullian down there because he was the first person to ever use the word Trinity. Somebody had to come up with it. That's who did. So those are just some of the names that pop up in the tradition of the church. And those are wonderful, important things to know. But of course, every tradition has got to have those who seek the best that they can to be faithful in transmitting the tradition. Nowadays, we have books. We have resources. We have people who dedicate their lives to passing on that tradition. But what was it like before all of that? What was it like? What did we have in the church to continue and pass on the traditions of the church? The what? Oral tradition. And who was the leading person in the church to do that? You think? Yeah, a bishop. A bishop or a priest. Now, John Wesley would say they're the same thing. But yes, it was the clergy. And that's why very early on in the history of the church, clergy are given this responsibility, but they're educated to it. And it's to pass on. So when John Wesley thinks about tradition, and he recognizes that what he is doing when he ordains, he doesn't call it ordain, first off. When he consecrates Thomas Coke to be a superintendent, he knows that he is making a break. He would say a slight break. His brother Charles would say this is a big break. They didn't agree on this one. But John Wesley thought he was making a necessary break with the tradition that he had received, because in the Church of England, only bishops can ordain, which is the act of laying hands on a person to be given the authority of a pastor or a priest. And John Wesley is not a bishop. That's why he won't use that term. He doesn't think it's appropriate. But he also thinks the sacraments are so important. What are our sacraments? And, yes, those two. Baptism and communion. Those are the two sacraments that we have. The sacraments are biblical and they are tradition. As a matter of fact, of all the parts of worship that we're given, the sacraments are the key. Those are so important because the sacraments are not just simply rituals that we go through, they are the conveying of grace. And that's really important because we cannot be the church without the grace of Jesus Christ. And we constantly renew that grace whenever we gather for worship. And the most significant way that we pass on that grace, that good news, is through the sacraments. So when Wesley saw the church in America cut off without sacraments, he saw a problem. Because one, you had to have people who were ordained to administer the sacraments correctly. John Wesley would not break with tradition to the point and say, anyone can do this. Some versions of the church did. And those exist to this day. And we don't make any criticism of those churches that do that. What I do say is that's just not what John Wesley wanted for his Methodists. He wanted us to have those who were appropriately authorized to administer the sacraments. And in order to achieve that, then what he did was take that extraordinary measure that he thought was necessary to have sacraments. But even in doing that, John Wesley still maintains this idea of apostolic succession. Okay. Who are the apostles? Name me an apostle. Matthew. Thomas. Judas. Jude. Peter. John. Yeah. Chief of which is who? Who's the chief apostle? Yes. Peter is the chief apostle. We will refer to these disciples after the resurrection as apostles. So, apostolic succession means that the teaching of the church, the vast tradition of the church, depends on an unbroken line from one person to another person to another person. An unbroken line. Now, our Roman Catholic friends will say this has to be done through Peter and the bishops. That only a bishop who is in the line of Peter is appropriate. And what that means is that you take average Catholic bishop, he has been consecrated a bishop by someone who is made a bishop, by someone who is made a bishop, by someone who is made a bishop, in an unbroken line, all the way to Peter. That's what they teach. And they're not wrong. That line is basically unbroken. Took a few twists and turns, but it is basically unbroken. Well, one of those twists and turns happened in England when it was Henry VIII's term to be king. You know what he did? He broke with the Church of England. But that was Henry VIII. He had someone who was helping him, who is the chief bishop in all of England. What's the chief bishop in all of England? Yes, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, how did the Canterbury get to have an archbishop? This is the story. Pope Gregory observed in Rome, I don't think he's at this point or not, observed in Rome some slaves being sold. They were from a faraway place. As a matter of fact, they were from as far away place as you could get in the Roman Empire. They were from England. He observed them and he felt compassion for them. Who are these poor people? What land do they represent? These heathens, these crazy, wild people from way up north across the sea. These English people, uncivilized. They need the church. So he looked around and he found this guy named Augustine. Now, this is not the Augustine from the 4th century. This is a different name, just the same Augustine, just the same name. And he sends Augustine to England, who settles in this little town, Canterbury, and it is from Augustine that the English church is formed. Now, I'm skipping over something, and I know I'm skipping over it, so if anyone catches me on this, I'll just tell you later on, I know that. I might even talk about that a little bit Sunday because it has to do with St. Patrick. So anyway, Augustine is the guy who starts the English church, the Archbishop of Canterbury. So when you go, now Pope Gregory was the 64th Pope. So who was the first Pope? Peter. Yes, very good. Peter. Peter to Gregory, 64 popes. So 64 steps. 64 different guys, it's all men, 64 different guys from Peter to Gregory. We have the list. We know their names. We don't know all their details, but we know their names. He sends Augustine. And this is the year 597. So Augustine organizes the Church of England. It's a Roman Catholic Church, and there is this unbroken line of archbishops of Canterbury who are chiefly responsible for the organization and running the church in England. And if you go 83 steps, 83 names, you come to this guy named Reginald. I don't know how you spell Reginald. I-N. Reginald Pole. Anybody ever heard of Reginald Pole? Reginald Pole was Archbishop of Canterbury, and he nearly got elected Pope. But didn't. But got close. But Reginald Pole was the last Roman Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury. And when he passes away, it becomes Thomas Cranmer, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury. And Thomas is willing to cooperate with Henry VIII and organizes the Church of England basically as we know it today. Archbishop of Canterbury, leader of the Church of England. What that means is that Thomas Cranmer, when he ceases, and there's another little few bumps here because of Queen Mary, Bloody Mary, some of that story. So there's a little bump or two here. But basically, from Thomas Cranmer, there's a whole long line of bishops who are ordained in all of the various towns, cities, places, communities, shires of England. And there is this unbroken line of all of these people, and eventually you come down to a line that ends with Bishop, what's his first name? John. From Thomas Cranmer to John Potter. John Potter is bishop, not of Canterbury, but of Oxford. John Potter, Bishop of Oxford. What that means is that anyone who graduates from the University of Oxford who is seeking to become a priest of the Church of England has to go through John Potter. That's his job. So one day John Wesley comes to him, and John Potter eventually ordains John Wesley. Okay. So there's John Wesley's connection to a line that goes through John Potter to Thomas Cranmer to Reginald Pole to Augustine to Gregory to Peter. An unbroken line. Some bumps, but basically an unbroken line. Now, what I will tell you is this. I'm not going to write these on the board. Thomas Coke is sent by John Wesley, and Thomas Coke consecrates Francis Asbury as bishop. We'll just go ahead and assume Asbury's terminology at this point. Bishop Asbury consecrates William McKendry as bishop. William McKendry consecrates William Capers as bishop. William Capers consecrates Holland McTyree as bishop. Holland McTyree consecrates Elijah Embry Hoss as bishop. Elijah Embry Hoss consecrates William Walter Peel to be a bishop. William Walter Peel consecrates Kern Usler to be a bishop. And Kern Usler in 1987 ordained me. As a presbyter, a Methodist priest, an elder, a pastor in the United Methodist Church. Which means, when you go all the way back through, I am 157 steps from Peter. And you're one step from me. All right. The point is, the tradition of the church is an unbroken line that goes through all of the age of the church, all of the countries of the church, all of the places of the church, all of the languages of the church, all of the writers and priests and pastors and lay people of all of the churches on an unbroken line all the way back to the apostles. And we should love that we have that heritage because we practice it every Sunday, including the one coming up. Okay. That's enough about tradition. 6 minutes left. Anybody got anything? Questions, ideas, thoughts, complaints? No, sir, he did not. John Wesley, when he left Georgia, he never crossed back over to the United States. And I don't think he left England. I mean, he did go to, I think he went to Ireland, but he never left England after that. And he didn't enjoy the United States either. Have you ever been to Georgia without air conditioning in the summer? You been to that church? It's a, yeah.
When you say that they withheld the sacraments, how could they withhold it?
Who? What'd you say? What'd you ask now?
When you say that they withheld the sacraments,
When they withheld the sacraments?
how did they do that? How could
Oh.
they withhold them?
Oh, you mean after the American Revolution?
Yeah, did they just say you can't?
No, they left. Most of the Episcopal priests left. Yeah, they were British. They didn't stay. Some of them, I think, went to Canada. Some of them stayed. Some of them did stay, but not enough. But a lot of them left. Some of them went to Canada, which was still English, and some of them did stay and continue to fight. But there was not enough. And so Wesley saw this as an opportunity out of necessity. And he says to the Bishop of Oxford, no, I think it was the Bishop of London. The Bishop of London had charge of the American colonies. He says to the Bishop of London, I've got a whole bunch of Methodists who will serve as pastors if you ordain them. And he said, no, they haven't been to Oxford. Or maybe that other school, Cambridge. So the answer was no, and that's what Wesley did. Anything else? Okay, thank you. Appreciate you pushing it up. Appreciate you putting up with me all of this tradition stuff. Be sure that you remember Gary